Welcome to the Connected Leadership Podcast. I'm Andy Lapata. Thank you very much for joining me. It's been a bit of a break since we've done some live streaming for a number of reasons. I've been not really around working for the last week because I had a back procedure, and then before that I was in a lot of pain. So where I needed to get interviews done, I got them done. But please excuse me for not doing them live while I was writhing in agony. But there are some really interesting interviews that I've done over the recent weeks that are on the podcast, and I would particularly point you to this week's podcast, which went live this morning, where I interviewed Valerie Belhassan, who's the global head of compliance HR at BNP Paribas. And I wanted to talk to Valerie about how a multinational organisation like BNP Paribas is handling remote working and the return to work, and how they see the return to the workplace and hybrid working. You know, what's their vision for the future, and Valerie shares some really interesting insights and thoughts on that. So that's on the Connected Leadership Podcast now, as of this morning. If you go to the URL that you can hopefully just see at the bottom of my name, at the bottom of the screen, podfollow.com/connected leadership, you can listen to that interview now, as well as some of the others that haven't been live streamed, so you might have missed them. Wherever you're joining from in the world, and whether you're watching and listening on Facebook, on LinkedIn, or on YouTube, you're very welcome. And please do share your comments and thoughts as we go through the day. Tell us where you're listening from and what you think about what's being shared and your own take. This is a topic that I know from previous experience. I think this will be my third or fourth time interviewing one of my guests, and those videos and podcasts are amongst the most popular that I've ever put out there. I think one of the videos has several thousand views on YouTube, and it's up there in the top 5 or 10 of the ones that I've done. So I expect this to be a popular topic. So please do join us. Please do share. Sometimes people are listening later or watching later thinking that I'm live, so just to help you out, it's currently 12 minutes past 4 in the UK on Monday the 20th of September. So if you're listening later today or later this week or whenever you are, please feel free to add in the chat, and I will pick it up, and hopefully my guest will pick that up at the appropriate time. But we won't obviously reply on the conversation because we'll all be finished and eating our dinner or whatever it is we might be doing. One of my guests' case, it might be lunch. But please feel free to contribute as well. So without any further ado, let's have a look at what our topic is for today. And the topic, as I said, is one that is a hot topic. It's a lot of people feel a connection to this in one way or another. I'm often asked by people, how can introverts network effectively? Are extroverts better at networking than introverts? And similar questions along those lines. And in the conversations that we've had over recent weeks about the impact of remote working, and the difficulties of not being able to build relationships when you're not in the office with people, some people have reached out to me and said, well, actually, as an introvert, I prefer this. This is better for me. I prefer to network from behind a computer. So I felt it was the appropriate time to start looking at the differences between introverts and extroverts and the impact on building professional relationships and networking with each other. And to help me do that, I have two fantastic guests from either side of the pond. So please welcome, joining me, Jennifer Carmwyler from New York. Jen and I met in Vancouver nearly a decade ago, and we recorded our first video on the topic back then. And as I said in the introduction, we've recorded a number since. So Jen, thank you very much for joining me.
My pleasure, Andy. And you look exactly the same, by the way.
Yes, well, that's one of the advantages of doing these things remotely. And I'm also joined by John Baker. I've also known John for a number of years. John's a former president of the Professional Speaking Association London region, and focuses a lot on how to make the world a more understanding place of introverts and a better place for introverts to engage, helping people in the workplace understand exactly what it means to be labelled as an introvert or an extrovert. So we are going to get into that and talk about the definitions, because I think it's very easy to say you're an introvert or an extrovert. It's black or it's white. And as we all know, life isn't quite like that. But let's come back to that shortly. Let's start with the period we've just been through, the last 18 months. I mentioned that I had been approached by some people who had said, well, actually, I prefer to build my relationships remotely because I'm an introvert. So the pandemic itself aside, because I would hate to say the last 18 months have been a good time for anyone particularly, but taking COVID out of the equation, has the lockdown been a positive for introverts? Jen, what's your take on that?
I would say, Andy, thank you also for having me again. It's always a pleasure. I think things have changed over the course of the 18 months. What we do is we work with introverted clients and organizations to try to harness and unleash the talent of their introverted workforce. And I think one trend that happened was that people, because of the whole push towards diversity, inclusion, and equity, there's more awareness that we can't make these decisions going back to hybrid or whatever we decide without really understanding there are nuances. As you mentioned, not every A introvert is like B introvert, right? So there's questions that we need to ask. But overall, our research showed that through the last 2 years, that it almost is 2 years, that introverts are very pleased with this type of a situation where they have flexibility. I would say that's true for women. I'd say that's true for a lot of groups where we were talking about these options for many, many years, and now we had to go there. And I think a lot of organizations realize, and individuals, including introverts, very much so, that this really suited their propensity to work on their own time, to not necessarily have many interruptions. We heard that a lot. There's been a lot of feedback on, I really can get a lot more done. So that element of focus is very primary in this whole win, I think, of what's happened. I can also tell you that there's been, as the improv people say, both and, right? There's also been challenges that I think if we keep those in mind, we can really navigate around them. And one of them has to do with the lack of connection. And one interesting stat that came out, I think it was almost 50% of the introverts who overall really, I say, liked remote work. We surveyed 200 people that self-identified as introverts. Many of them, almost half, said that they missed that opportunity to get to know people outside of their function, outside of their team. There were a lot of meetings, Zoom fatigue. We talked about Zoom, but the chance walk by, another department that you might have in the office, for instance, didn't happen. And that's not just from a socialization standpoint, which, by the way, and we can ask John about this, being our resident introvert on the call. That introverts do like people and they need people. It's just how much, right? So people were saying they were feeling isolated, but it was socialization, but it was also collaboration on projects. So, that sort of extemporaneous, or I should say spontaneous kind of walk by, we talk about the lack of the water cooler chat, where you're learning about the context of what other departments and other people are doing. And that's how, related to your topic, people build relationships. So I think I wish I could give you like a concrete yes overall, but I think it's been a great learning opportunity for us.
It's really interesting the way you answered that, Jen, because I think it's very easy to come up, and again we're going to come to the definition of introvert extrovert shortly, but it's very easy to come up with a stereotype of what an introvert is, what it means to be an introvert. And there's that I guess the classic in dramas of the nerd, the geek behind the computer keyboard who never wants to go out and so forth. And so when someone said to me, well, actually I don't want to do my water cooler networking, this is great for me, that might not represent every introvert. And When I talk to people about introverts networking, I say, well, don't go to the big event where it's loud and there's lots of people, but have lots of one-to-one conversations. And you're saying that's missing. And John, I can see you nodding along with that. What's your take on that particular part of it, that relationship building element, and how it has changed over the last 18 months?
Well, I think coming back to that, my answer very similar to Jen. There's a big yes and a big no in the whole thing. First of all, my survey, similarly to Jen's, would show that there were many introverts who go, it's great. We don't have to be in the office all the time. We don't have to be faced with loads of people thrusting themselves in front of us and interrupting. At the same time, and I came up with 45%, so we're not that dissimilar, Jen, which was where introverts are going, you know what? I'm really missing people. I'm really missing the connections with people. And so what I found with those people is that, and I'm going to talk about myself there, because I can put myself straight into that 45%, which was I'm an introvert. And yeah, there was, from a networking perspective, the last 18 months in some ways have been phenomenally good. But let's talk about what's good about them, and let's talk about what's not been so good. So the good things have been relationships where I've already known people. I've deepened those quite specifically because I've done, and I know you talk about this a lot, Andy, which is to reach out to people in your network and spend quality time with them. And that's been a deliberate act. And that's been really, really useful. And Zoom or whatever system we want to talk about has been great for doing that. At the same time, I have actually got to say I've missed some of the events where you meet up with people. And I like being with people at times and in my small little amount, in my little way. And I have missed the connection. So the relationships I've got, which were important to me, I have developed well, as have 45% of people I've spoken to about this. The relationships which you might have gained otherwise by going to events, many people have actually really missed that. And so I think there's definitely a good big yes and a no. And I think it really does come back to this, we all like being with people at times, maybe in different degrees. And as you implied, no one introvert is exactly the same, and there's a scale on all of these things.
And it's picking up on what you've said there, John, and also what I think was Jen said about the ability to focus in a focused environment. I mean, I would have classified myself as an extrovert for much of my life, and I think that most people who see me in professional circumstances would think I'm an extrovert. I've noticed myself lean more and more towards introversion over the years in many of the ways that I draw energy, and we'll come on to that. But going back 15 years or more, in my last business, I took myself away from the office to work from home because I couldn't focus in the office. And I still needed that human connection, but I was running a business network. So I was at a networking group every morning, 4 mornings a week. I had plenty of connection. So I saw John wince there, and I was there. That was my job, to run them. This is why.
No, Andy, I didn't mean to interrupt. I remember really having to negotiate and make this whole business case each time I wanted to do that as a learning development professional, that I could just stay home one day and work on the damn thing, and not have to sit in the office with all of this distraction. Even extroverts need that focus. So that's what I'm saying. I think now we have organizations much more open to that possibility of flexibility. Don't you think?
I think the flexibility, I think, is incredibly important. And then, in a way, building on from the networking example and coming back to it, but the way we run a lot of projects, I think, is something which companies are starting to realize. We don't need to have everybody in the room all the time because it wastes huge amounts of time. There are stages of most projects where you need to have, and the last 18 months have made this worse, you need to have the connections, you need to have people in the room. There are stages in the projects where doing that is a complete waste of time. And those are far better off. Those are far better off being done remotely and using some of the project management tools.
Well, actually, one of the takeaways from my recent conversation with Valerie Belhassan at BNP Paribas was that when people come into the office, because they're going to see a lot more hybrid working as things settle down, they need to use that time in the office intelligently and not just have people in the office doing what they would do when they were working from home, just so that they can tick the being in the office box. So as an introvert, if you have more knowledge that you're going into the office with a purpose and you're engaging and connecting with people with a purpose, is that going to help people prepare for that and make sure that they're comfortable in the environment and they're going to make the most out of it?
Well, to build on John's point
help,
too
yeah.
about the meetings, I mean, I think one of the things that we have learned from our research is that stress came out on the positive side, less stress, but more stress from all the virtual meetings, from Zoom fatigue.
Yeah.
I mean, that's become a term now, because to John's point, projects now are really we don't need to meet all the time, whether we meet in person or on Zoom. Much of the work of creative pursuit comes out, it really gets done in individual work. I mean, there's a lot of research around that. So are we really consciously thinking about whether or not we even need to meet? And then when we do meet, are we employing things like good meeting hygiene with agendas? And most companies, most groups are not doing that. And this is exhausting, particularly for introverts, because as you guys were saying, the people time just saps energy. So I think that we have to look at the whole picture.
Well, let's pick up on that zapping energy point, and I touched on this briefly. I said we would get to the definitions. I think this is a good time to do it. And John, as I understand it, I'm not the expert in introverts and extroverts. My conversations over the years with the two of you mean I've probably got a better understanding than I would have had otherwise. But one of the things I understand about it is that one of the things that can define where you are is where you draw your energy from. Can you perhaps elaborate on that a bit for us, please, John?
Absolutely. So, as you said, it's about drawing energy, and the typical, and so we're now going up to one end of the spectrum. The typical extrovert will draw their energy and gain energy when they're in a room full of people. So the kind of networking events which you were doing 4 days a week, and they will find incredibly energizing. Now, the introvert at the other end of the spectrum, and I'll talk about me because that's just easy rather than putting words in somebody else's mouth. I will go along to them, and I can enjoy it for a while, but very quickly I'll just go. It's like, the way I look at it is, do you remember, Andy, the old Nokia 3310? I think it was one of the first mobile phones I ever had, and they were great, they worked, but every time you wanted to talk to people on them, you could almost watch the battery just go. And so you then take it away and charge it up quietly behind. So I call the Nokia 3310 like the introvert phone. Whereas nowadays, these phones last for hours and can carry on communicating forevermore. So very much, I think the energy thing, I think that's where I would start with. And that's the kind of Jungian basis of the whole thing.
So that then leads to the impact of the lockdown on people, because I think for most people, however they label themselves, okay, you put yourself in there, let me put myself in there, John. I think the first lockdown, and I'm talking UK lockdowns here, because obviously there will be different calendars for different listeners in different countries, but the first UK lockdown in the spring to summer of 2020 was a relief for me. I had been in constant meetings. I'd been going to a lot of events. I was on a course where I was with a group of people for a whole day every few weeks, and on calls with them every single week. I was socializing a lot as well. So I was probably out 3 or 4 nights a week, and a similar number of days a week. In fact, I used to say that if I'm more than 3 days a week at my desk, or 2.5 days, it's too much. And if I'm in more than 3 evenings a week at home, it's too much. So the first lockdown became a relief for me. It was, I could stay in guilt-free, fear of missing out, FOMO free, and just restore my reserves of energy. Lockdown 2021, post-Christmas last year and into the early months of this year, I found being at home on my own the whole time energy sapping. So I think that there is that element of, last year I needed my own space in order to recharge. This year I needed other people in order to charge me back up again. So you've got one person coming from both sides. Jen.
I'd like to add something to John's basic definition, which I agree with. That's where I always come from on this. But there's been a lot of interesting research. I call it kind of introversion 2.0, 3.0, 4. It's really about about stimulation, which aligns with what we're saying, right, John? And
Yep.
How much stimulation can you take? And so the question, I always ask people a deal breaker question. It seems to help when they're trying to figure out, am I on which side of the bell curve am I on? And as we said earlier, most of us cluster towards the middle. It's like we're all kind of towards the middle, but we tend to have a preference. And so what I say is, must you have time by yourself after being with people all day, or like at that networking function that John was talking about? Must you have downtime? And John, you would probably answer what?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
I mean, classic Andy mentioned the PSA meetings a little while ago, and we've all experienced these meetings, which are full of international speakers, absolutely amazing sessions. And after a day of doing this in London, I can promise you that the Sunday and the Monday, for 2 days, I'd be as much use as a chocolate fireguard if I'd tried to do any work. I'm completely wiped out.
Yeah, well, that's a great example. You're case number one there, right? But extroverts will get energized by that, as John said. However, I will say that they will go, and then they'll crash, right? Yeah. So the whole idea of they can take more stimulation. And now we have a compelling brain research that talks about the reaction response to dopamine, that extroverts need more of it. So that's why when I come home and an introvert Bill is in the kitchen, cooking quietly with some smooth jazz, and the lights I can barely see, and I'm turning the lights on. Hey, Bill, putting up the volume, and he's like this, And so there's a lot of people that are introverted have very sensitivity to that sensory input. So it's quite interesting to look at it from many different layers now, building on what Carl Jung said so brilliantly back in the early 1900s.
So you've both mentioned the extremes, if you like, and you've both mentioned where this energy comes from. There's going to be outliers, of course, but I think, as I said earlier, we're oversimplifying things by saying this person is an introvert, that person is an extrovert. Most of us, I'm sure, would have elements of both. I can definitely feel both within my personality in different environments, as I've shared with that example. How can we use these labels in a constructive way to help us understand ourselves, and then how to understand other people as well, and how to engage with them? John?
I think labels are incredibly good and incredibly dangerous, and I think that's the important thing. So, quick example, I have this habit at home which drives my other half up the wall, and I'll put all the ingredients, cake ingredients, into plastic tubs, and I never bother labelling them, because I'll just go, yeah, that's that and that's that. And of course Angie comes along, and it takes her a whole lot longer to make a cake than it would do if I was doing it myself, because I know what stuff is. So the labels can be really useful because you can diagnose something much more quickly, but ultimately, the label does not define what you're going to make. So in business, being able to spot an introvert, if you like, or an extrovert, or somebody in the middle, because we have a label, can be really useful. But then if we then go, right, because I've said that they are 30% on the scale towards an introvert, I'm now going to apply everything else that goes with that label, that becomes incredibly dangerous. So I think the big thing with labels is, remember, they can be useful for quickly looking, but not to sit there and say, right, this person is going to therefore always be like this.
Yeah, and I think the more you are familiar with the material, I would agree with John. I love your example of the ingredients. That's a great one. I think the more you're around it, it's like learning a foreign language. You start to, when you're immersed in it and you're looking through that lens, I'll use another analogy. I look at different pairs of glasses I put on when I'm meeting somebody or talking with them, and even subconsciously I'm thinking, their age, their cultural background, just all kinds of distinguishing factors. And introversion, extrovert, in my mind, because I've been working in this a while, comes to mind. Now, the important thing is, I agree with John, we can't just like typecast people. And a lot of people actually go the other way. It's like, I'm not going to even take the assessment. You know, it's like, okay, you can do that. But I think part of it is really you understanding yourself. Like John, Andy, you know, you go back and forth. You know in what situations you need that alone time, for instance. But you also, the important piece of that, the second part to me that's even more important, is to communicate that. So people, our teammates and our families and the people we're interacting with are not in guesswork mode all the time. So like if we just sort of a basic understanding of these personality types, and then we get the elephant out of the room and we say, you know what, I need this time now to not have lunch with the team. I need to focus. That's all you have to say. It just minimizes so much of the disconnect and the distrust and the assumptions that people make when we're upfront about this. But that is part of the problem that I see in the workplace. We sort of do all this like guessing about people and make assumptions that are oftentimes very negative.
That's such an important point, and it's made me think that there's the obvious assumptions that people might make in a workplace. So rather than John is an introvert, we think, well, John's a bit sullen. He's not a team player.
Smiles.
And you know, when you get to know John, you know that's not the case. But because he understands he's an introvert and he communicates that. But we're now we're not moving into, we are in a time that I don't recall like it in my life, where mental health issues are rightly high on the agenda. There's much more awareness of them, but are we more likely to misdiagnose people as having issues they don't have purely because they want their own time, they want their own space, they separate themselves from the crowd, they don't take up invites, and are we overcomplicating something that actually might be quite simple and harmless?
John, you want to take that one?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think there can be a great danger in that. And I was talking to somebody earlier on today, and they said, why do you focus on introvert, extrovert rather than, and they named half a dozen different personality assessment tools, MBTI, DISC, etc., etc. And all of those tools are good. They all have some really good things about them. But to me, if we can start to understand a way of beginning to approach somebody's personality, and for me, introvert, extrovert is 2 dimensions or 1 dimension rather than 16, that's a good way to start thinking about it. From then on, it's about watching, listening. It's about working out what that person is like and being open to that, their likes and dislikes, rather than going with our own biases and, you know, as you said, and I've had it said, so Andy, and you know I have because we've talked about it. John's very quiet, therefore he must be boom, boom, boom. But it's about understanding that very often that comes from a bias that we've got inside us or society's given us. And
right.
The simple answer to the question, Andy, is use a tool as a quick label to perhaps help, but then discard that and work on the person. And if we're going to be better leaders or better networkers, it's about understanding the person and moving beyond a label, but sure, use that label as a quick, it looks like they might be introverted, I'll try and do this and this. And then moving beyond that and understanding
Exactly. Andy, I think I must say that it's like any other element, as I said earlier, about diversity, inclusion, and equity. If we're ignorant, we're going to be biased. Yeah. And so one of the positives that I have seen in being in this space for over 12 years now is that we have hundreds of, probably thousands now, of coaches that are specializing in this. We have companies that on a daily basis, I'm hearing from organizations where they're starting these employee resource groups where there's a movement internally to educate people. The fact that we're even having this conversation, when we had it years ago with Ivan, that was an outlier, right? Because you're ahead of the curve, Andy. You always are. That's a compliment, by the way.
I know, thank you.
I'm trying to butter him up. He told me to do that.
I thought it was so that you would get easier questions.
That's right. So anyway, that's where I think education is very important.
And it's interesting you talk about that curve, and you talk about the drive within organisations coming from employee resource groups, ERGs. If anyone hasn't come across those, that's like the women's networks, the Asian network, the gay network, whichever it might be. And I find that with a lot of my work as well. Now I'm getting booked by the core business, but for years it's been driven by those employee resource groups. Are you finding that is changing? Are you finding that the key decision makers in the core business units are starting to look for this now, or is it still driven by volunteers within the organisation?
Oh, that's a great question, Andy, because I was in the same spot. So here's what's happened that I've noticed. We've had growing numbers of ERGs, but they are sponsored by more senior leaders. And it's been easier through the pandemic. It's been easier to get them to get on the call. So what I decided to do was to create, instead of doing my standard keynote where I talk about introversion, et cetera, and leadership, I invite the group to bring in the highest level introvert that they can find. And we've had CEOs, CFOs who come and do a fireside chat. Now, how impactful is that when people see at that level, you can be an introvert and be very successful? And they talk about the challenges and how they navigate an extroverted world in their culture. Now, to me, that's the most powerful statement. And so, in answer to your question, it's not the thing that's kept CEOs up at night, but more and more they're self-identifying. And I think it's going to become increasingly part of just a natural way of expressing yourself and identifying yourself as a senior leader. We're still got a little ways to go. Can I give you one more quick example before I shut up? I was on LinkedIn the other day where we all spend a lot of time, and there was a posting by the head of the CTO and one of the founders of HubSpot. And his first line was, "Not bad for an introverted boy from a village in India." And he had just been named one of the more recent billionaires. Okay. So, I think that wouldn't have been something, John, I think that we would have seen, right, years ago, that people are now starting to speak up.
I think you would have seen the introvert achieve it, but they wouldn't have necessarily owned it in the same way. John, how are you finding it? Are you finding that there is an appetite from business units within business to find out more about this, or is it coming from the individuals themselves?
I'm seeing both still. I was listening to Jen's example. I thought it was a great example. So I'm seeing more senior people wanting to get involved, more senior people wanting to talk about it, which is brilliant. And I wasn't sure, the last 18 months, because I've had a couple of things like Jen's where we've been working on a group and they've been able to drag senior people into the discussion, perhaps because it's been on Zoom, rather than having to get people into a room. And I'm hoping that will now continue and roll into the old way, a new hybrid way, shall we say, rather than because they were on Zoom, actually it was an easy give half an hour. But so I'm seeing some positive signs. I'm not yet persuaded that it's all there.
No, I agree with you. However, I think that I mentioned earlier, the DIE, whatever we're calling it, all kinds of things, but it's now also that umbrella of the organization, Andy, has embraced different elements of diversity. And the next one they're talking about, which introversion really is a part of, is neurodiversity. So you have Asperger's, learning issues, and that's becoming more legitimized. And they're looking for other areas like that to highlight. So I think John's right. It's cautious optimism. Would you say, John?
I think that's a great way of summarising it. Thank you,
that makes a lot of sense. Well, okay, let's come back to one of the other topics that I touched on at the very beginning. And I've always argued, as I said, that introverts are potentially better networkers than extroverts. So many introverts have come up to me and said, how do we network? Because their perception of networking is of a big event with lots of noisy people. I've simply said, well, don't go to the event. Just find people and have one-to-one meetings or small group meetings with them. But right. I feel that introverts tend to be better listeners rather than putting themselves at the centre of everything. And as a result, that's one of the biggest skills in building relationships, is to listen to other people. And Dale Carnegie said the sweetest sound to any man is the sound of his own name. and the introvert is going to repeat your name, not the extrovert so much. So John, what's your take on that?
I mean, I would agree with you, but I think it comes back to what you perceive networking to be all about. So I absolutely endorse what you just said. If networking is about results from working with people, I don't think it can be anything else, then I think introverts can make much better networkers. However, and I've got to say, go back a number of years when I was still living in big corporate life, doing the flying around Europe and training people and sales teams and all the rest of it, networking then appeared to be seen as having a large number of people that know you, going to an event where you just speak louder than everyone else, and having a bigger stack of business cards than anyone else. And what was the value in that? None at all. But if that's what you believe networking is, I'm sure extrovert has an advantage.
When one of you does your next survey, I would love to know. So I have a model of the 7 stages of professional relationship, which go from where you just recognize each other because you've bumped into each other a couple of times, to where you're a friend at stage 7 and an advocate at stage 6. I would love to see a survey done of where extroverts score their networks and where introverts score their networks, because my sense would be that the introverts would be much deeper. The relationships would be much deeper. The number in the network might not be as high, but the strength, the depth of the relationship would be much higher.
Let me just say the challenge that introverts share with me a lot. And you know, as an extrovert who likes to schmooze, I like to go to those events to a point. I like to introduce people. I like to connect people like you, Andy. And introverts will say to me, I wish I could do that. And to me, that's a natural part of how I operate. And they feel like they have to do it that way, you know. But we teach them tricks, particularly in those group gatherings, teach folks tricks on how. My favorite one is introducing 2 people who don't know each other, and you don't know them either, but you just say, Indy, have you met John? And you slowly move away. That's my favorite one. But no, I think that extroverts do, you know, play a big role in being able to connect people. And I think that it shouldn't be looked at as one is better than the other. I don't even like the question, Andy. I think they do it differently. The challenge I hear a lot from introverts, they say they hate networking because they look at it with that paradigm of like going to schmooze at these events. And it isn't about that. And what we found in our research on influence with introverts is that they use social media in a very intentional way. And that's been a plus for them if they use it correctly. So getting their brand out there so they have more visibility, connecting with people that interest them, that they're curious about, and doing that online where you don't have to necessarily talk, and giving it thought about how can I improve and increase my platform, connect in deeper relationships, like you said, might make a phone call, might take a phone call after that, you know, initial connection like John and I are going to do, right, John? We're going to have a phone call.
Looking forward to that, Jen.
Right. So it's more meaningful. But I think let's not discount the positive and the plus that social media has been for introverts.
Well, and I believe that, you know, social media, the original message boards came about because it was introverts, IT geeks, finding a way that they could communicate, so they didn't want to go to these big events. So that's actually where it stemmed from originally. I'm told. I've noticed, by the way, Jen, you've stopped buttering me up now. How did the next?
My mind went with that was message boards. I was thinking back to college when people used to get rides on the message board, and they would try to meet people that way. Anyway, that's very extraneous.
How did an extrovert like yourself come to specialize in understanding introverts?
Well, I'm still married 47 years later, and I attribute that to I had to learn or I was going to go crazy, because this guy, we would go to these parties and he would be nice and sociable and then wouldn't talk for a whole evening. I had to learn about how to navigate. Both of us did. And we think that was a big plus in our relationship. He's upstairs. I probably won't see him all day. So we're but as I came into the workplace doing a lot of consulting, HR stuff, leadership development, I found that there was not very much knowledge in coaching about introversion, and I found that it was really helpful to clients to have those insights. I worked a lot in tech, so
Yeah.
you can imagine with engineers, IT, and they were so appreciative that the ball started going. And that's when I ended up writing the first book, The Introverted Leader, back in 2010.
Well, let's pick up on this point about lots of engineers, because we often associate certain functions with either introvert or extrovert traits. I mean, the most obvious extrovert function might be a sales role, would be a very obvious one. There are other obvious ones as well. I remember I've done a lot of work with the actuarial profession, and I remember the first time I gave a talk for the Institute of Actuaries, someone told me that, said to me, how do you tell an outgoing and extrovert actuary? They look at the other person's shoes. And I actually told that joke in the talk, and it went down okay. It seemed to. They rebooked me anyway. And actually, we all come from a professional speaking is a core of what we each do, that is often associated with extrovert tendencies. John, I know you're an introvert. I've already shared where I'm an ambivert, I think the term is. I know a number of the top speakers in the world who are self-professed introverts. So how true are those stereotypes, and how can we use them constructively? John, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I think that like all these things, there is of course going to be some truth in them. There's some logic in the fact that the accounting one is another one. You mentioned actuaries. I used to work a lot with accountants, and there is a stereotype that accountants are all introverts. However, I know a vast number of brilliant accountants who are not. But if I went through the list of all the accountants I could even remember and totaled it up, I would have to say that there are more introverts in that profession than extroverts. So is the label useful? Well, maybe it helps us to prepare if we were going to give a presentation to, or if we were going to do some work with a group. Is it useful because it's true? No. And I think that's probably the same for many others. The classic one is, and I've been told it before when people have said to me, John, you can't possibly be an introvert because you like standing up on stage and speaking. And of course, everyone knows that all speakers are extroverts, don't they? Except they're not.
They're not.
Running the PSA in London, suddenly you get some fantastic international speakers come over, and they're going up on stage, and you suddenly realise, wow, that really isn't extroverted behaviours that he or she is displaying when they're not in front of the crowd.
Yes,
and that's
yes.
true for many of them. And
Absolutely.
Last weekend, I was running the green room for a folk festival, and great people up on stage, some fantastic bands, great music, really nice weekend, and yet there we are again. Oh, singers and presenters and performers, they're all extrovert, except no, they're not.
One thing I was just going to say about that I have been told, John, and you can validate this or not, is that, and I agree with you, professors, performers, oftentimes are more introverted. And it's because what I've learned, what I've heard, is that you play a role. You know what the role, two things, you know what the role is. And when you're on stage, you can be in that role and be very clear about that. The other thing is the preparation. So the preparation allows you to be in the moment and to maybe even seem like you're extroverted, but it's because you've prepared so well to do that. So I wondered if you agree with that. Yeah.
I think it becomes a bit of a safe place as well, doesn't it? You're in your zone, your comfort zone, and actually, when you're on the stage, you are on your own. You're not. I think the best speakers engage in a conversation, but you have control of that conversation, and that probably makes a big difference as well.
One speaker I was interviewing said just that. He said it is the most introverted place he spends his time. He's up on the stage and he is there. And there's a large element, and you mentioned the control word, Andy, large element of that. Very true.
Yes. It's counterintuitive, isn't it? You wouldn't necessarily think that way. But I would say that also you're engaging everybody in your audience more if you're using introverted qualities like pausing. Like, you see speakers who are a little more extroverted and anxious. And when they're not getting a response, what do? they speak faster, they speak louder, they keep going. And that's even more of a turnoff to the introverts in the room because they don't embrace silence. They can't even handle that. But the introverts, I find, they're used to silence. They're okay if we don't get an immediate reaction. They can let it settle. And I've learned that from my introverted colleagues. It's been a real lesson, a real positive lesson.
I think reflecting back on the two of your answers to that question, it really goes back to John's answer earlier, is the understanding that accountants or actuaries typically might be more introverted helps you when you approach it, but then treat everyone as an individual. So when I'm planning a talk for actuaries, I will think I'm going to get less engagement, less interaction from the audience. People will put their hands up less. If it's a talk for sales professionals, they're going to be more demanding. They're vocally more demanding. That helps me prepare, and I have been surprised. I think in every audience by the behaviour of people that don't fit that, and that goes to John's use it as a guide, but not as a prescription.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. And then be there and be open to what's happening. Right. So it allows you to do that when you have that presence.
And as you said, Jen, introverts will tend to prepare a lot more so that they can be in that moment. And again, I've often said when people say to me, well, how can you tell if somebody's an introvert? And the preparing or winging it is not part of the Jungian thing, but where I've done survey after survey, I've seen again and again that introverts tend to much more prepare. Extroverts are much happier to wing it.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that would fit as well. So we've got these different personality styles which lead to different behaviour. This is the Connected Leadership podcast. So let's have our last question focus on bringing that all together as a leader. If you lead a team with a mix of personality styles, how can you create an even playing field so that everyone feels that they've got their opportunity to shine? If you're an extrovert leader, how do you make the introverts comfortable and vice versa as well? And also so that you can play off the respective strengths of each group. Jen, do you want to come in on that?
I can briefly comment on that. I think it's good leadership practice, especially now since we have a lot of remote still going on. It's getting to know your people individually and finding out what it is they need and want and how they best like to communicate. That's number one, so that you can then, when you are with the group, you can, or even with them individually, you can adapt your style. And number two, as I had mentioned earlier, to encourage people to express that, create structures where they can do that to each other. There was one document that Google developed, which actually is a user's guide that I put in my last book. It's available online, where people just say a couple of ways in which they like to be communicated with, whether it's written or et cetera. And it gives very specific guidelines, a user guide. It makes sense, right? To avoid a lot of the disconnects. So I think as a leader, you can do that by encouraging that interpersonal connection, as well as you supporting people and not making it, as one company said, they called it loudership as the norm.
Loudership, I like that.
Couldn't get over that word. Yeah.
and from John, the quiet leader?
I would start with help the team. Very much the same. Help the team understand each other's styles and the plus and minuses of those styles. And Jen made a great point about the Google example. One of the loveliest things of many years ago, I was doing colour insights. It's a personality test. They gave everybody, after we'd all discussed the styles and all the rest of it, they gave everyone a name tag that went on their desk when everyone went back to the office that was in one of the colours. And it was really, really simple. It kept the discussion going on in that business for many, many months. And that was when people would really start to understand each other's styles and automatically just go, yeah, you're red, be bright, be brief, be gone. Boom.
Do you believe that the tools that you see, there's Crystal Knows, for example, that you can add to LinkedIn that will analyse someone's profile, or you can add your emails that will analyse their writing and it will tell you their style and how to engage with them. Do you think that's a useful tool?
I have not heard of that.
Yeah. Sorry, Jen, go on.
Jen was saying she hasn't heard of it.
Andy's a bit ahead of the curve, so he's
I've
teaching me
used
about
it
something.
on LinkedIn. I've used it on emails. I quite like them, I've got to say, and a lot of the time they seem to be right, but that also means a lot of the time they're not completely right. So again, use it as a quick guide, and then develop it from there.
Great.
One thing I want to say about those things that John, you said, where you say who you are. Some people push back on that. Again, they don't want the label, but I think the greatest use I've seen of those is we can laugh. Laughter is the shortest distance between two people. It was comedian Victor Borger said that years ago. And I find the most healthy teams, and we've seen this in studies on psychological safety, are able to laugh. So I remember one person used to say to me, on Myers-Briggs, she said, "I don't have any F in me whatsoever today, Jennifer. So please don't come and make any chit chat." And we laughed about it because she was serious. I'm glad I didn't. She probably would have bit my head off. But we can make fun of our own personalities and be self-disclosive that way and laugh.
And that comes back to what John was saying about communicate your personality to other people. If you understand what you need, communicate it to other people. And it becomes, I guess, a virtuous circle, because the more you communicate that, the closer the trust, the closer the relationship, which means the more you can communicate it and the more you understand it. And it's about getting into that cycle in the first place. And having an open conversation can help do that. Well, hopefully this discussion will help trigger some conversations and some thoughts along those lines. Jen and John, I had to get Jen and John in there at some point.
Jen and
John, thank you. Thank you so much for your contribution, and thanks for joining me on the Connected Leadership podcast.
It's been brilliant. Thank you.
Total pleasure on my part.
Great. Okay, so we are going. If you're both okay, if you need a sip of water or a stretch, or we'll just crack on.
Yeah. So, okay, and this is going to be where you ask us the other questions, right?
Yeah. So this is the 3 questions. We're still streaming live.
I thought that went great, by the way. Okay.
We are still streaming live, but we'll edit this for the podcast.
Well, they can tell us, the audience who's there.
Absolutely.
There's hundreds of people, right?
Yeah, there were hundreds of very silent, introverted people.
I forgot you were streaming.
Right, okay, are you ready to go on this?
Yeah.
So what I'll do, I'm going to pre-record the intros and the outros, or record them separately. So I'm going to go straight in on the first question. John, you're going to come in on this to begin with. So the initial question is, in what way have professional relationships positively impacted you in your career to date? So you can just go with your answer to that.
Okay, so when I look back over my career and professional relationships I've had with people, is interesting because as an introvert, he says for a second, I look at the most influential people I've ever worked with, and they have been extroverts, or in DISC terms, in fact, really big on the I scale, which almost doesn't feel right. But
can you just, for people who don't know DISC, can you just expand on that for them?
Yeah, so essentially DISC has 4 quadrants where it analyses your personality, and the D and the I piece are much more, I've got to get it the right way around because I don't use it enough nowadays, much more, so hang on, let's just think about the I and the S pieces are much more people focused, and the S and the Ds are much more task focused, or essentially in a way kind of introvert extrovert, although it's not explicitly that. And so the I one is very, very much outgoing, very much driven type kind of person, but also people focused. And the best relationships I've ever had have been people like that, and this is the critical thing, because your question was great, it's made me think, that have had the time to stop and respect other styles. And that's the really key point, because I think we can all get on very well, but each of us requires something different. And for me, somebody that's not going to respect me and my style, I'm going to really struggle to get on with. And that's the one big learning I had when I thought about this question.
I love that. Over the year that we've been running the Connected Leadership podcast, there have been a number of themes that have come up in answer to this question. But I don't think I've had anyone say the people who have stopped and respected and understood. And it fits very much with what you talked about in our Monday podcast in terms of focus on the person, understand the individual as well. So the fact that that's the advice you gave on Monday, and then today you're saying that's what impacted you, brings the two together really nicely as well. Jen?
I hadn't even thought of it like that, so that's good.
Jen, how about you?
Andy's so good at connecting. I'll tell you, he connects ideas and people. The biggest impact on my career and why, I would say, when I think back on that, Andy, it's the managers I've had who have been both excellent and the worst ones. And, when I was a young parent with my first child, I remember I was buying all these books and totally a wreck and trying to do it right. And I remember one of my wise mentor women friends. Oops, I think you just froze.
We can still hear you. We can still hear you. Carry on.
Okay. So one of my wise women friends, who is a mentor, said to me, Jennifer, it's what you do that your children are going to learn from more than anything, what they observe. And that stuck with me as I got in the workplace. So I had, a wonderful boss at one point who I learned so much from. She was incredible in terms of how just the content pieces of being a leader. And then I remember one of my early bosses who thought my only role at the meetings as the one counselor on staff was to make the coffee and take notes. Now, this was a long time ago. Okay. But I had to learn to be assertive from that, eventually speak up. So those are the pivotal experiences, I think, both very extreme ends of the spectrum. Fantastic mentor/bosses, and others who I just wouldn't want to be anything like. And I was able to craft other ways that would really fit me. So that's what comes to mind.
I think I can relate to that. I've shared in the podcast before my Goldilocks and the three bosses, where I had in my first job, proper job post uni, I had one boss who was too cold, one boss who was too warm, and one who was just right. And that, I've never professed to have been a good manager, but that definitely influenced how I tried to be. Moving on from there, we can definitely learn from everyone that we've worked with, and it's nice because I think that as a question, this has over the year has brought out a lot of examples of what does make a good leader and build and where leaders can build strong relationships just by guests reflecting on their own experience.
It could be something a manager said to you that stayed with you. Somebody was sharing with me the other day something, and an idea popped in about an experience I had. About being authentic at work. It was a discussion we were having, and I remembered one leader who critiqued me and gave me negative feedback because she said my laugh was too loud. Now that was 20 years ago.
Wow.
But I still remember that, and that really shut me down for a while. I ended up not staying at that firm because it was a consult. It didn't fit, that culture didn't fit, my sense of being. But it really did a number on my self-esteem. So, I think I learned from that too. It's like the power of words that you can have on people.
The other one, just something you just said there, Jen, just reminded me of another bit of an answer I'd give to your question, Andy, which is about the type of people. The people that I've been impacted by the most have been those that, and this, as speakers, this will be no surprise to us, have told most stories. In our normal day-to-day working, the leaders that would chat and put in a relevant story are the ones that had the biggest impact on me. And you said it, Jen, you said the power of words, and it absolutely. Yeah. They've got to be relatable words.
Right, because they share themselves. They share a part of themselves that way, right? What'd you say, Andy?
Absolutely.
Well, that's what
over the interview.
That's well, I'll back off here. That's what stories do, isn't it? Stories make ideas relatable, and we all know that. So and that's living testament to that. Okay, so that's the good traits and that's the good leaders. Where have relationships gone wrong for you, and what have you learned from it? Jen, I'm going to ask you to share that on this one first.
Yeah, well, related to what we talked about on the podcast about understanding people's personality styles, I remember taking a job where I had a new direct a new report. Actually, she had been there and I came in new. And I remember I was so pumped up, ready to start and get going with all these exciting programs. And she I learned later, was very introverted. I didn't take the time to really assess her personality. And I did what I talked about on the podcast. I ran as fast as I could, kept going faster to try to get her to be enthusiastic, and it had the opposite effect until I was kind of put back on course by a wise HR friend and consultant in the company. So I think when I wasn't aware and took the time to really assess what somebody's vibe was like and tried to impose my style on them, that's when I've had the hardest time in work relationships, I would say.
Yeah, and that would make complete sense. It would fit with everything we talked about in the main podcast. And I think all of us have made that mistake at some point, imposing what we find important, how we think things should happen, how we like to converse and engage, and expect other people to follow, when in fact it can rub them up the wrong way. And that goes to the heart of the introvert v extrovert conversation that we had. John, how about for you?
I'm going to jump back to something I was thinking of when we did the Monday podcast, when you were talking about leadership, and my first day in my second ever proper job. It's your fault for reminding me. It's that far ago, a minute ago, Andy. But basically, I went into this place and big team meeting. Just so happened that was my first day, and everyone was standing around in there. The leader walked in, clicked his fingers, handed out the agenda, and then just proceeded to go through it. And he'd praise the people that were quick and forthcoming and on their feet with answers, despite the fact that I'm kind of hiding in the corner hoping he doesn't ask me anything. And I'm looking at the 3-inch thick pile of, because it was a long time ago, it's when we had paper rather than tablets, 3-inch thick pile of data. And these guys in the corner coming out with these amazingly quick answers, and he's praising them for being quick. And I'm looking at these sheets and going, their answers have got nothing to do with the data. They don't even know the data. And then he'd ask some of the other quieter ones in the team what they thought. And then he would almost be parodying them, almost being rude about them, because they were stopping and thinking and looking at the data. And now at the time, I just thought, that's a horrible place to work. I really don't want to work there. And I lasted about 6 months before I went and left. But interestingly, lots of the other people had also left during that time. And he was like that, not just in the meetings, he was like that the whole time. And where I've ended up seeing people that work like that and almost make you believe, almost make you believe that it's you that's wrong and everything, you're misinterpreting and blah. We might almost take it nowadays and call it narcissism, but it was just the way that this particular meeting encapsulated that whole, I'm right, I'm the extrovert, I'm going to praise the extroverts and ignore the introverts kind of thing. And it's not about introvert, extrovert, it is about one style just pretending to be more important than all the others. And they're not. All of the different styles, whatever mechanism you use to test that is, all the different styles have got real strengths that we ought to be playing with and bringing out, rather than just trashing people because they don't think and work in the same way as you do.
And you're right, that goes back to my last question on the Monday podcast, which was all about how do you bring the best out of a team, which is a mix of personality styles. And there's been a thread running through the conversation across both podcasts, which is understand the other person, understand their style, and adapt. And this is a great example of someone who failed to do that.
Yeah, but number one, know yourself. It has to start with you.
Yeah.
Right?
But not stop with you. And I think this is where people go.
Be both, though. Yeah. But I'd like to just point out something that I've been observing about our conversation. And John, you've noticed several times, has gone back to other ideas and gone deeper. And Andy, you and I are moving on. I think this is a great meta example of what an introvert does so well, because they stop, and they think he needed a little time to connect the dots. And but boy, powerful points you're making, John. Yep. And I'm not just buttering you up either. But
I was going to say, hang on. You were nice to Andy a minute ago, then you stopped. So does that mean you're going to stop being nice to me? But seriously, Jen, you're absolutely right. Absolutely right. I hadn't thought of it, and it's a great example of it.
Well, it is a great example. Absolutely.
Well, I'm going to claim the centre ground, not just because on the video I'm in the middle, but I'm going to claim the centre ground as the ambivert here and say that I'll take the best from both of you. Moving on to our final question. I always like to ask our guests to recommend books, talks, podcasts, whatever else it might be that have really either had a big impact on your career over a period of time, or maybe something that's resonated recently. So, John, what stood out for you?
And it's probably a rubbish book in many, many ways, but
good start.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the simplest book, and it's definitely had the biggest impact on my leadership life, if I can put it like that. On the first day when I became an area retail manager, I had to drop somebody off at a station, and then I was driving to work. But at the station, I bought a book, and it was the 1 Minute Manager. Now you go, oh, I remember that. That's really old. And I pulled it over in a lay-by, and I was flicking through it, and it's incredibly simple to read, which is probably why I liked it, because I'm simple. But I almost just kept reading it because it was, oh wow, this is great, and I almost never made it to the next store that I was supposed to be visiting because it was just so good. But then starting to enact that, and then Christmas present that year, all my managers got a copy of it, and they all said the same. It was incredibly powerful because it's simple.
Right.
Yeah, and as someone who's written short books and longer books, that can resonate with me. There are different spaces for different books, but Connected Leadership, which was nominated for Best Short Book last year in the Business Book Awards, it's half the length of Just Ask, but it doesn't make it, in my mind, less powerful. It's just the right vehicle for the right topic at the right time, and when you want to get across some simple information that's practical and easy to implement, then that's where you want to go. So that's the 1 Minute Manager. And for you, Jen, what have you got for us?
Oh boy. Okay, well, my book would be Emotional Intelligence. That book just made a big difference in my life. I had been raised in a culture and through schools where achievement was it, and achievement and intelligence were all about just your grades in school and that kind of thing. And so when I realized that there was so much more to intelligence, backed up by research, in terms of how you know yourself and how you connect with others, it was really almost like a sigh of relief. That, I knew this is something I just couldn't put my finger on, je ne sais quoi, but when it happened, there it was. And it's really been a base for me in really assessing how I'm doing, but also how other people are relating to me. It was a benchmark book, Emotional Intelligence. And then I also, just to throw in a few more, I'm a big news junkie, and I like to read particularly trends and business news and I read 3 newspapers in the morning. The New York Times, the LA Times, because my daughter lives there and I want to know what's going on, but also the Washington Post. And I listen to podcasts. I've always listened to podcasts, but currently some of my favorites are Work Trends, which is a wonderful podcast about what's happening out there, very timely. And I also like Guy Raz's How I Built This, which talks to founders and goes deep on there. So there's a lot more I could provide to people, but great way to learn.
Excellent. A nice mix from the two of you of a couple of classics and some more modern resources as well. So that's perfect. Jen and John, I'll say it again. Thank you very much for joining me. I knew this would be a really interesting topic to explore. And the Monday podcast, if anyone hasn't listened to that, I would highly recommend. And thank you for joining me on the Connected Leadership podcast.
It's my pleasure, Andy. You are a connector, that I'll say for sure. Thank you for the pleasure.
Loved being here, Andy. Thank you.
Thank you both. So thanks for joining us. If you've joined the live stream and you've sat there silently, that's fine. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you've got any questions, Jen and John are tagged in the Facebook and LinkedIn streams, so if you want to post any questions there, they will be able to pick them up, and if you haven't done already, please check out the Connected Leadership podcast back catalogue. If you go through my activity on LinkedIn, you'll see previous live streams, and of course you can go to podfollow.com/connected leadership. There's over 100 episodes there for you to enjoy with some fantastic guests over the last year. So thank you very much. I may well be back on Friday afternoon UK time, just waiting to firm up that interview. So keep your eye on my social media feeds, but I'll see you soon on the Connected Leadership Podcast.